There are many ballet schools in the world. The most famous and popular have long been considered the French and American ones. Until the mid-80s, that's how it was. No one imagined that anyone else could wedge themselves into the rivalry between these schools. However, nothing lasts forever. And in 1988, out from behind the backs of the old-timers jumped the Belgian School of Ballet, sometimes also called the Flemish School. The main culprit behind this rise was just one single representative of that school, a kid named François Van Varenberg. Today, I'd like to recall François' triumphant start on American soil and take a closer look at the decline of the Muscles from Brussels' star career in the late 90s and early 2000s. Unlike many other actors, Jean-Claude Van Damme made himself. Moving to America at the very beginning of the 80s, Van Damme started from the very bottom. For a while, nobody paid any attention to the signals he was sending. He had to scrape by on odd jobs. The future actor even worked as a pizza delivery guy for a time. In breaks between his day jobs, the Belgian would regularly run to all sorts of auditions. After one of them, he landed in the film Monaco Forever. This wasn't his first appearance on the big screen. Back in 1979, he'd popped up in the Belgian film Woman Between Wolf and Dog. One of the leads there was played by Rutger Hauer. But nobody noticed the most famous Belgian of all, which is more or less what happened with Monaco Forever. The film ran only 48 minutes and was savaged by both audiences and critics. Van Damme's career nearly ended right there. What saved it was his meeting with Chuck Norris through Cine Films. In 1984, Chuck Norris invited Van Damme to work as a punching bag in Missing in Action. You can't spot Van Damme in the actual film, even though he did stunt work somewhere in the background. But his stint as Chuck's punching bag would bear fruit later on. First, though, Van Damme decided to appear in the sci-fi film Predator. There are all sorts of rumors and legends surrounding that particular chapter. According to one version, François didn't quite decipher the fine print in the contract and signed on without understanding that his face would never be seen on screen. According to another, he simply behaved too provocatively on set and tried to practice his famous Belgian kick on someone. Jesse Ventura claims that it was for landing that kick a little too successfully that Van Damme was fired. A third version says he was fired simply because he was too small and looked outright comical next to Arnold. The original Predator was shaped like some kind of alien giraffe, making Van Damme's height less noticeable. When they redesigned the creature, the need for a tiny Belgian disappeared. Still, a couple of shots with Van Damme remained in the film. They say it's him you see running through the jungle from the enraged black guy. In 1986, Van Damme got a role as one of the antagonists in No Retreat, No Surrender. The film was quite popular back in the days of video parlors. In it, Van Damme played a Slavic fighter named Ivan. The Belgian desperately needed a breakthrough role and did everything he could to get noticed. Having landed No Retreat, No Surrender, he more or less got his wish. The script was written on the fly, right during shooting, and all the actors improvised wildly on set. Van Damme was the clear record holder in that field. For his first $250 a day, he beat up half the cast. If the script required a single punch, Jean-Claude would throw 4. When they asked him to do 2, he did 10. Timothy Baker and Peter Cunningham were the biggest victims of Van Damme's improvisation. On the ring, he pounded Cunningham to the point of losing his pulse. They carried the actor off unconscious twice in a single shooting day. As for Baker, Van Damme delivered a couple dozen blows instead of the one that had been planned. Baker was so outraged by Van Damme's behavior that years later he showed up in court, where the now more star Belgian was being sued for injuring Jackson Pickney on the set of Cyborg. In court, Baker claimed Van Damme had a reckless disregard for human life and continued to pound him despite the screams of No Retreat, No Surrender director Corey Ewan. While making that film, Van Damme was barely making ends meet and often asked the other actors after a shooting day to help push start his car. Without that clever trick, it wouldn't start. The film didn't become any kind of major hit in theaters, but it easily earned back its small budget. It was precisely his part in that film that allowed Van Damme to get into Bloodsport. With that under his arm, he kept haunting the offices at Cine Group, trying to reach one of the producers Chuck had once introduced him to. He was very lucky here, although in 1986 it might not have seemed that way. They pulled out a script for him that had been gathering dust at the studio for a couple of years. The film, with a budget of $1.5 million, was extremely problematic in production. After filming wrapped in 1986, it was shelved. Test screenings went very badly, and Cine Group didn't want to release that film in theaters. It was only thanks to the fact that an actor like Black Eagle was born, in which Van Damme once again played a bad Slav. This time his name was Little Andre. Since nobody knew anything about Bloodsport at that point, Van Damme had signed a 2-picture deal with Imperial Entertainment, where he could very well have ended up as a lethally expendable secondary character. Even though he wasn't yet a star, the Black Eagle script was tweaked a bit for his character. The tweaks were made right before shooting. True to tradition, the Belgian immediately started beating up any actor who crossed his path. Even the lead, Sho Kosugi, took a few. It's said Kosugi eventually got tired of the precise blows François kept landing on his face. He snapped and started punching the Belgian right back. It ended with the actors being pulled apart. Van Damme then refused to die at Kosugi's hands in the finale, so they quickly rewrote the ending and killed him off under the propeller of some boat instead. After working on such a wonderful film, Van Damme realized it could bury his entire career. That's when the event happened that could have determined his whole future. He tried his hand at editing. Deciding that Bloodsport was the film that could save him, he convinced the bosses at Cine Group to hand over all the footage and let him cut it into a real movie. Jean-Claude managed to assemble a version of Bloodsport that satisfied all the producers. As a result, in 1988, 2 years after shooting had wrapped, the film finally reached theaters. Black Eagle, incidentally, never did make it to theaters, which may have turned out to be a stroke of luck for the Belgian. Bloodsport did wonderfully by the standards of its budget. In the US, it took in $12 million, and the rest of the world added another 18. In France, 1 million people went out to see the film about the legendary Belgian. His career, as they say, took off. But first came Cyborg, which nearly buried it again. Director Albert Pune cobbled together the Cyborg script from 2 separate Cine Group projects. The first was a sequel to the failed Masters of the Universe with Dolph Lundgren. The second was based on Marvel's Spider-Man comics. Cine Group needed to recoup the money already spent on developing those films. Total costs for prepping the 2 projects had already exceeded $1.5 million. All the groundwork, costumes, and sets were recycled into Cyborg. The actual Cyborg only cost them about $500,000. Since Cine Group was already thrashing about in convulsions from a string of flops, they shot the movie in the tightest possible time frame and wherever they could. Almost all the actors played multiple roles. Naturally, this showed. Test screenings turned out to be a catastrophe. Only 1 out of 100 viewers gave it a positive rating. Nobody, however, wanted to throw the film on a far shelf this time. The disgruntled producers wanted to rush Cyborg into theaters, get rid of it, and squeeze out at least some money. But Van Damme once again stepped into the equation and convinced them to give him time for a new edit. This was around when that court case mentioned earlier took place. Van Damme had struck Jackson Pinckney in the eye with a prop sword, and Pinckney sued. Van Damme had to pay the actor the amount he demanded. The exact figure was never disclosed. At the box office, the film did reasonably well, though it couldn't match Bloodsport's success. On a $2 million budget, it grossed $10 million in the US. The rest of the world added some change too, though exact numbers are hard to find now. Cyborg was followed by Kickboxer, which became a genuine worldwide hit. Costing only $1.5 million, it collected over $40 million globally, 15 of that from the American box office. The French once again occupied their cinemas, And this time, German movie fans weren't far behind. After Kickboxer's success came Van Damme's last film for Cine Group. Most would probably agree that the least well-known film from this peak period is Death Warrant, or as it was often called in the 90s, Dying Time, or The Unbreakable. Its relative obscurity likely has a lot to do with the fact that it was made by a studio already on its deathbed. Jean-Claude Van Damme owes Cine Group a great debt for giving him his big break with Bloodsport. But while his star was burning ever brighter, the studio's star, to put it mildly, was fading fast. That wasn't Van Damme's fault. His films made money. It was the studio's bigger projects, like Sylvester Stallone's Over the Top, that were crashing hard. There's another interesting point here. According to Van Damme, he snatched the role in Death Warrant right from under Steven Seagal's nose. People often say they fell out over little barbs and jabs they threw at each other in interviews. For instance, Van Damme once speculated that Seagal's sudden expansion was his attempt to change his appearance and hide from the mob. But the real conflict started with Death Warrant. While Death Warrant was wrapping, Cine Group decided to declare bankruptcy. The Belgian wasn't too worried at that point. Having finished his part, he went off to shoot Lionheart. Cine's assets started passing into the hands of MGM. That process isn't quick, so Death Warrant sat on a shelf for over a year. Lionheart, by and large, turned out to be a fluke for Van Damme. He was forced into it by his two-picture commitment to Imperial Entertainment. Those obligations forced him to come up with the idea for Lionheart and take part in writing the script. Among his ideas were the Scottish kilt on one of the fighters, Attila's white cat as a nod to James Bond, a fight ending in a single blow, and so on. Naturally, he also personally lobbied for the scene in which his bare backside is shown without the slightest shame. At the time of its release, Lionheart became the most successful film of the Belgian's career in box office terms. In the US alone, it earned $24 million. Its budget was also the largest of his career up to that point, $6 million. There are no consolidated global box office numbers, but we do have the audience counts in France and Germany, which were record-breaking for Van Damme. While Lionheart was roaring in theaters, Death Warrant finally passed to MGM. But since nobody really cared about that film and the studio just slapped it together to have something, many versions still open with the logo of the already defunct Cine Group. In the US release, MGM did at least fix that. The funny thing is that thanks to Van Damme's growing fame, this tossed-out film, released 2 years after shooting wrapped, completely devoid of marketing and already forgotten by everyone, still managed to make decent money. With a budget of $4 million, it took $16 million in the US. How much MGM made on the video market is anyone's guess. Van Damme, meanwhile, was rapidly heading into the stratosphere. His next film, Double Impact, broke his box office record yet again. Jean-Claude badly wanted to do a movie about such different twins. He believed that role helped his image and showed he could play distinctly different characters. Not everyone saw the film's potential, though. Albert Pyun, who directed Cyborg in 1989, said in an interview that in the late 80s, Van Damme came to him with a proposal to work together on a film called The Corsican Brothers, about twin brothers. Pyun claims he told Van Damme the idea was too ridiculous, advised him not to appear in such nonsense, and at the same time urged him to quit drinking altogether. After that conversation, Pyun says, he never saw or spoke to Van Damme again. In the US, Double Impact made $30 million. There are no proper worldwide figures, but in France nearly 2 million people saw it, and in Germany about 1.5 million. So the oft-quoted 70 million worldwide gross is perfectly believable. Van Damme entered the early 90s as a superstar. Each of his films was earning more than the last. His fees grew along with his sense of self-importance. His fondness for various illegal substances kept pace as well. But as long as he brought in money, nobody cared. In 1993, he nearly stumbled with Nowhere to Run. The thing is, Nowhere to Run was originally supposed to be a completely different film. The script was written by Joe Esterhaas and director Richard Marquand. Marquand had wanted to direct it himself in the late 80s, but he died of a heart attack in 87. On his resume was Star Wars: Return of the Jedi. Esterhaus and Marquand's script had no fistfights and almost no action at all. Its only overlap with the finished film is the storyline of the escaped convict and the widow with 2 kids. It was basically a love story. Mel Gibson was supposed to play the lead, but after Marquand's death, the script was shelved. In the early 90s, screenwriter Leslie Boehm reworked it into a vehicle for action star Jean-Claude Van Damme. Joe Esterhaus publicly disowned Nowhere to Run, stating that nothing of his script remained in the film. The Belgian admitted in an interview that he didn't like the story at all, but the screenwriter shook his hand and solemnly promised to polish the script and bring it up to scratch. Van Damme believed him and didn't turn the role down. When it came time to shoot, it turned out that nobody had even tried to change the script. At that point, Nowhere to Run was Van Damme's second most expensive film after Universal Soldier, and his highest paycheck to date. He got $2.5 million. At the box office, the film took a step back compared to his previous work and essentially flopped in the US. The rest of the world rescued François, pulling the project up to break even. 1994 became Van Damme's peak in box office terms. Time Cop finally crossed the $100 million worldwide mark. And ahead of him glittered an even more expensive movie, Street Fighter, which was supposed to be a major hit. It didn't flop outright, but its awful audience scores and the Belgians' behavior on set did their damage. From there, his career began to stall. The aptly titled Sudden Death, which followed Street Fighter, became the last film for which he received a hefty fee. He was paid $5 million. No one will be surprised to hear that the film had plenty of problems even before Van Damme signed on. The script was initially offered to Arnold Schwarzenegger. He turned it down due to scheduling conflicts. He was already signed on to True Lies and then Junior. After Arnie, the offer went to Sylvester Stallone. Stallone read the script and passed, saying it was too raw and needed work. The third actor in line was Bruce Willis, who declined because he was preparing for Die Hard with a Vengeance. Only then did the producers go to Van Damme, and he agreed to the lead. After that, the film's budget was cut almost in half. The existing script was heavily rewritten right before shooting. Randy Feldman, who wrote the first draft, says it had been a parody of an action movie. The only scene that survived intact from his script to the final film was the fight with the hockey team's mascot. Sudden Death became Van Damme's first box office failure. It grossed $64 million, but with a $35 million budget, that wasn't enough to recoup. The film probably squeaked into profit thanks to video, but the sequel, whose script was already written when Sudden Death hit theaters, was immediately canceled by the studio. Van Damme tried to save his career himself. His contract with Universal allowed him to release The Quest, where he also took the director's chair. But he couldn't hit the jackpot twice the way he had with Bloodsport. Just like Sudden Death, the film underperformed at the box office, and Universal tore up his contract. Around this time, the Belgian also turned down the villain role in a big-budget Warner Brothers actioner, Sandblast, in which Wesley Snipes was supposed to play the hero. The film never happened and was shelved. The next period of Van Damme's career is very dark. Seeing where his career was headed, he started drinking more, partying harder, and sinking deeper into drugs. Somewhere around here, the story of Van Damme getting beaten up at the Scores nightclub took place, known mostly from the accounts of Mickey Rourke and Chuck Zito. It was Zito in particular whom Van Damme had a run-in with. According to Zito, his mistake that fateful night was going over to greet Van Damme and Mickey Rourke, who'd come to spend the evening at the club. The story goes that the tipsy Belgian immediately started acting aggressive toward him. Not wanting to escalate the situation, Zito, after greeting them and hearing his name deliberately mangled, politely took his leave. And maybe that would have been the end of it. But then a club employee Zito knew came up to him and asked him why he was smiling so warmly at Van Damme. who was talking trash about him behind his back. Turned out that as soon as Zito walked away, the employee had asked the Belgian for an autograph and mentioned that they had a mutual acquaintance, Chuck Zito, to which Van Damme responded with mockery and snide remarks. Only after that did Zito walk over to Van Damme again and ask for an explanation. All he got in response was the standard arrogance from the Belgian kid. That was the last straw. Zito says he snapped and jumped Van Damme. He beat him for about 30 seconds. The chair flew out from under the actor, and dark glasses and black belts scattered in all directions. Just as Zito was about to turn the Belgian into shoe leather, security rushed in and pulled him off. Van Damme himself always dodges the subject and only ever says that none of this happened. Zito claims he even needed hospitalization because he managed to injure his hand on Jean-Claude's head. Mickey Rourke and the club's owners back up his story. But there are also plenty of witnesses who saw a perfectly cheerful Van Damme walking out of the club, calmly signing autographs outside, with no signs of having been destroyed. Since there were no lawsuits afterwards, many assume it was just a minor scuffle that the press inflated into the annihilation of the brave Belgian. As for his film career, things were not just bad, they were terrible. His films were gradually being pulled from theatrical release. Legionnaire, which was supposed to open in theaters, was hastily pulled from the schedule after Knockoff bombed. Inferno, directed by John G. Avildsen, followed it straight to video. Then came the loud thud of the Universal Soldier sequel at the box office, which drew a line under François' theatrical life. His budgets nosedived, and he didn't make it into American theaters again until The Expendables. In Europe, a few of his films still managed to squeeze into theaters on tiny releases. The Order, Derailed, Replicant, In Hell, Wake of Death played in places like Spain, but they took home peanuts. By the mid-2000s, Van Damme had moved to the direct-to-video world full-time. A small, partial exception was the crime comedy JCVD, which got a wide release in France, though it didn't escape a box office flop there either. After 2010, he made occasional attempts to remind the world of himself. Sylvester Stallone helped him there with The Expendables, but things didn't go much further. Attempts to get a foothold on the small screen also came to nothing. Van Damme still shows up now and then in films with terrifying titles and ratings, but he does it rarely enough, which is probably for the best. He could clearly be starring in piles of such trash much more often if he wanted to. It's a bit of a shame he started trying to change his character and get rid of his destructive habits too late. Things might have turned out differently. After a couple of flops, studios might not have dropped him in batches and might have given the actor more chances.